Welcome back, everybody. Our next panel deals with the very important and timely topic of global diversity and inclusion. Our speakers are Libra Clemens, Chief Diversity Officer at Twilio, Dr. Jennifer Lewis, Adjunct Faculty for the Online Business Programs, Marilyn Ridley, Undergraduate Student in the Online Business Program, and Prudence Pitter, Adjunct Faculty in Human Resource Management and Organizational Behavior and Leadership. This will be a wide-ranging discussion on the pressing issues of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Professor Pitter will moderate the discussion.
Thank you, Carlos. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, ladies, for joining us this afternoon. I'm looking forward to our time together. I would like to kick us off with a little bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's at the forefront of many organization minds these days, certainly at the minds of students and employees. And I know that we will leave today's session with some great information that will help us not only think about how we can make a difference, but other ways that we can share feedback within our organizations and other individuals that we are close with. So over the past few months, I've been incredibly proud of how some organizations have responded to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I've also been shocked, quite frankly, at how many organizations seemingly pretend this is not an issue that needs to be addressed. I'm really looking forward to the feedback today on strategies and initiatives and ways that we can all become a champion for change. Libra, I'd like to start with you, if it's okay. What has your organization done, or any organization you admire for that matter, in 2020 to enhance or develop diversity, equity, and inclusion goals in the workplace?
Yeah, so I actually just joined as the Chief Diversity Officer for Twilio about 2 months ago. So what I am is I'm entering into a company that has done a great deal, and I was really excited. And one of the reasons why I took on this role was because they didn't have a Chief Diversity Officer for about a year, and throughout all of COVID, George Floyd, I was the most impressed with how they responded. So this is, Twilio is a cloud-based company. It's a tech company. We're based out in San Francisco. Our headquarters is in San Francisco, but we're a global company. And the majority of the Chief Diversity Officer roles in tech companies, not all, but the majority of them, 99% of them, the Chief Diversity Officer does not report to the CEO. And as someone who's been in the diversity space for almost 15 years, what I've recognized over the years is that in order for you to have impact, for you to actually have any movement or influence or agency, you have to have a voice. And in my mind, that voice needs to be heard on the executive team in partnership with the CEO and also your Chief People Officer. And so what was so impressive about Twilio was that they listed this role in January before everything happened. So they listed a Chief Diversity Officer, brand new. They had a diversity person before who did some great work, but they recognized that this role needed to report to Jeff, who was our CEO, and sit within the executive team. So this wasn't in response to this. They weren't throwing money everywhere. It was really just proactive and thinking about how they address some of their inequities in the early 2020. Another thing that happened is that shortly after all of all the racial unrest and so forth, the executive team, not our Black employee resource group, but the executive team sat down and created what they call our version of a strategy to address racial injustice. And again, it was so beautifully written. It was thoughtful. It was owned by the executive team and the CEO. They conferred with the ERGs, but the ERGs didn't create it nor drive it. It was focused on internally, the internal population to which they made good on it, providing coaching, creating development programs, thinking about equity in terms of all of our processes, in terms of payment, but also opportunities for people to understand how you get it, you advance through the ranks. the ethical use of our products. I think a lot of companies forget that part. And as a communications company platform, we do have members of law enforcement using our app. And so how do we do this? And I'm not saying we've addressed it or addressing it, but there was just conversations around the ethical use of our products in general. Where do we draw the line? As well as what else can we do to support racial inequities? We also released a statement, and actually I wasn't even working there at the time. Like I said, I started 2 months ago, where there was a commitment to being an anti-racist company. And so I have to give the company a lot of credit for doing this. I'm coming in and just on the tail end and really kind of putting it all into practice, but I don't own it. The executive team, and I am part of the executive team, owns the process and owns the strategy. So that's a little bit about, I don't know if that's exactly what you were looking for, but to me, it's something that I'm really proud of. And it was really a major decision factor in, and going to Twilio, especially thinking about all of the tech companies, and they're tech companies that are doing some great work, but I was really, really, really impressed with the leveling of this role, the commitment to being anti-racist. I haven't heard that from anyone else. And all of the resources that were not just money to Black communities, like, hey, here's all your cash, but it was a very thoughtful and intentional strategy around addressing equity.
Thank you. That's great. One group you mentioned within your organization, I missed the name of it. It's a Black. You said that the response came from the executive team, not from that particular group.
No, the Black employee resource groups. So employee resource groups. Yeah. So their affinity groups and employee resource groups are they're groups within a corporation, and actually universities have them as well, that are there to support and create a community for various demographics. And so there's a Black one, a Latinx, an LGBT one, people with disabilities. And it's there to provide support and a safe space for these, the folks of the same affinity to come together. What we have done at Twilio and what I did at PayPal and other companies, it's an open organization. So I belong to every single employee resource group. I want to learn what it's like to be a veteran. I don't know. I don't know what it's like to be LGBT, but I need to learn. And so they come together, they share ideas, there's resources, there's awareness, they do a lot of events. They are the backbone behind a lot of the heritage months, like Hispanic Heritage Month, or we reframed it to be Latinx Heritage Month, was most recently September 15th to October 15th. And so that particular employee resource group organized a lot of activities, educational opportunities, and so forth for the rest of our Twilions, as we call them, to be educated around the Latinx experience. And so we do that for every group.
Great, thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Jennifer, I'd like to get your feedback on the same question, please. What has your organization or an organization that you admire done this year to enhance or develop diversity, equity, and inclusion goals in the workplace?
So I'm going to talk about, well, I'll give you both, one that I admire and what my organization has done. Not that I don't admire it, because obviously it was me who put it in place. So one of the things I've done, I mean, this is a really unprecedented year for us when we're thinking about COVID and people working at home. And so we all started working at home in March. So my plans completely changed because I had to readjust everything in terms of working remotely. And then the George Floyd incident happened. And I have to say, I am really impressed with Libra when she talks about senior management, really taking the leadership role here. That is not the case for me. I lean very heavily on my Diversity and Inclusion Council, as well as my ERGs, which we refer to as affinity group leaders. So I have 9 affinity groups, and each of them are chaired by someone in the organization. And I have 12 members of my diversity council. And they really have become my eyes and ears of the organization. And so they really feed me with a lot of information in terms of how employees are feeling and some of the things that I need to address in the organization. I also ran a lot of lunch and learns to help managers deal with, how do you talk to Black employees after some of these things have happened in the social injustices? And I leveraged outside people to come in, and I had a lot of open forums through Zoom where we invited employees to come and share and just talk about their feelings and everything that was going on. So it was a little different this year because we are all working remotely than it would have been if I was in the office. Although I probably would have done the same thing. It's just that we would have had that human interaction that we unfortunately did not have. So another organization that I have done some consulting work with, I'm really impressed with them because they took an even deeper dive and they did a lot of social injustice work where they had employees talk to their non-people of color leaders and really share with them how they were feeling about the organization in terms of if they felt discriminated against, how they felt that they were being included. And I thought that was really different for a company to go that deep and that innovative in terms of doing that type of work.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. I'd love to hear some of the main takeaways, if you will, from the Lunch and Learns. I know those are very effective. The employees who come are usually those who want to share. So if you wouldn't mind sharing one or two takeaways from a couple of the Lunch and Learns with us.
Yeah, it's interesting because many of the employees who wanted to attend the Lunch and Learn were not our Black employees, surprisingly. So, and the reason I reached out and tried to find out why, and what I heard is that it was a very emotional topic and they really didn't want to put themselves in that vulnerable position. So it took some prodding on my part to get them to actually attend. Once they were there, it was fine. But even through Zoom, it was a lot of tears. It was a lot of emotion. And I think it brought people together and help people understand that this is really raw for those who watch this person's life be taken from them. And what does it mean for you as a Black employee when you come into the corporate world and how you are viewed? So, some of my takeaways is that, one, it is emotional. I think a lot of times employees will try to cover up their feelings, particularly Black employees. They will try to cover up their feelings to assimilate in an organization. So that was very challenging for them. The other takeaway I have to say is that I got a lot of questions afterwards. Why are we only focused on Black employees? So it was a lot of why not me, right? Why not my group? So those are my two takeaways.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's really intriguing. I've certainly heard a lot of that, and some individuals view it as watering down the problem or feedback on, well, why can't we focus on disabled people or the elderly? They don't have the same rights as well, and not necessarily focusing on the problem at hand.
Yeah, and I would just add one other thing. What I heard from a lot of employees, particularly Black employees, is this a flavor of the month? Like, once this dies down and we move on, what happens then? There's all this focus on Black employees and what do we need in terms of social justice. But what happens when, the notoriety of it all goes away? Do we still keep that energy, keep that focus going?
Yeah. If you wouldn't mind sharing before I go to Marilyn, what is your response to that? And then what is your commitment to ensure it's not a flavor of the month?
Yeah, my response to that is that we will continue to work on this issue. That is my role. That is my commitment to the organization. But for me, it's not just Black employees, it's all employees, it's all people of color. And it's how do we create this equality for all people of color? And so right now, yes, the focus is on Black employees, but I don't see that that's where it will end. So what I have said to employees who have made that comment to me is that this will not end. I've been with the organization now for 15 years. And for 15 years, I've been at it. So I don't anticipate it changing.
Great. Thanks,
Can I
Jennifer.
also add
Sure.
this? I think Jennifer just nailed it. Here's what I always say. If you can solve for trying to figure out a situation with Black people, everybody benefits. Like, it's the least common denominator. And I feel like a lot of companies do that with business, but they don't do that with people. And think about the folks that are continuing to be oppressed on a regular basis. You know, if you can figure out a plan to support them, then everybody else at some point will benefit globally. So I agree with Jennifer. I don't think this is a flavor of the month type of thing. I do think that I can imagine that after a while, we won't be referring to this situation as the George Floyd. We would just be like that moment when the world woke up and realized racism was real, especially in corporate America. And we're thinking about what the impacts are ultimately on the business. And so we've got to shift the conversation from it being just one incident and being more of this is how we need to change how we operate as a company.
Thanks for that, Libra. Great addition. Hi, Marilyn. I'd love to hear your perspective as a student, either from your organization or an organization that you admire, specific to the response to diversity, equity, and inclusion this year.
I was happy to be a part of the Committee on Institutional Equity and Diversity that was formed last fall with SPS. And it was important for the dean to bring forth more diversity between staff and students. He even mentioned wanting to make sure there was more male Black students within our healthcare services major to become nurses. So I was happy to be a part of that, and they wanted to identify the issues and find ways to address the concerns within SPS, also to train staff and faculty on more diversity, and to build and maintain a student database on diversity within SPS. From my own experience, going along with Dr. Lewis's points, I am a part of a women's entrepreneur group, and when this incident, as we were talking about, happened, one of our women of color had a hard time continuing to be amongst us because she didn't know how to talk about this incident with us. And as Dr. Lewis had mentioned, it's important for us also to reach out and let others know that, we're here to listen to them, and that we're open. I know Ms. Clemens was a part of Morgan Stanley at one time, and I just retired there last year. And I know she's familiar with Carla Harris, who is very much a part of the diversity at Morgan Stanley. And it was important for me also to, not so much when I started in 2000, to kind of change the way Black women especially were perceived there, as it's a very blue blood society. And even the sense of changing my hair was something that was really resonated with others there, because we have children who were having their locks cut within our country. And it was important for me to be a part of society that showed that, our hair is, something sacred to us, and that it can be a part of any, whether it's Wall Street or it's a part of the educational field or wherever. So.
Thank you so much for sharing, and I certainly appreciate you including personal examples as well. I'd like to stay with you for a little bit longer if I could, and ask this question. What advice would you provide to organizations that may not currently reflect the cultural diversity that they would like? They have the goal, but they don't know where to start. What advice would you give them?
I believe it's all about opening up the table for discussion. People do want to show up, I think the discussion of race has been opened up in our country, and now's not the time. Over the weekend, we were celebrating that change has taken place here in America, but don't let that die down. You know, let's open up the table and keep that going. You know, sometimes we believe that, you know, it'll be scooped back under the rug, you know, when, you know, a little bit of change comes, but keep the conversation going. And how can we do that here in SPS, and how can we do that within our own companies? So I believe it's just a thing of sitting down and opening up the table. So many people have been afraid to address it. So let's start addressing it. Let's not hide from it.
Right, you're saying start with a conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you for that. Libra, same question for you. What advice would you give to organizations who are not on the same path as your organization currently? They recognize the opportunity for a more diverse culture within their workplace, but are not sure where and how to start.
Yeah, I don't understand. It baffles me so much that companies are still struggling with this. I mean, it's like some weird math problem that they cannot solve. Because if this were a business problem, they would be figuring it out. Like they'd be sitting around in a room, just like our executive team did, and came up with a solution. So it's boggling to me that people can't figure out situations that are so unknown to them and that make them slightly uncomfortable. Like, I don't like budgets, but I don't not do my budget. I wake up, I have to do a budget for my team. So I'm giving you a flip answer because it's so frustrating to me that people can't figure out their people issues at work when you can't have a company if you don't have people that work there. But I will say, if you're starting from the beginnings, I think a lot of companies over index on just recruiting as a way to get diversity, and that because everyone thinks that a diversity person runs around and recruits. That's not the job, and that's not exactly what it is. But I also think that there has to be representation at the top. And so I think I would appreciate companies who are really trying to start, that they look at their board and their senior level, their executive team, or however they define it, and figure out how they're going to diversify it. Oftentimes companies start at the very junior levels because it's so much easier, and they don't stay. That's not your pipeline. That's not a diversity number. Those are just people coming in to work there for 2 years to go someplace else. So I think it needs to be part of your corporate strategy and not just a thing on the side, and like a little, and hiring whoever thinks they know diversity as your chief diversity officer to just placate your Black and brown employees. I think this is your job. Like the CEO and the executive team, your job is to figure this out as you would a balance sheet that didn't balance. And so I think that just pushing and making sure people understand that this is a business, this is part of strategy, that if you want to really start somewhere, start looking at your top and figure out how diverse they are, and then kind of go from there.
That's a great point, Libra. I had a conversation with an organization, and my point was, it's interesting how we're all COVID experts now in such a very short time. COVID is brand new in some ways, and we've managed to learn everything we need to know about COVID, how to pivot, do exactly what we need to do to keep the business running. Can we put a percentage of that effort into diversity, equity, and inclusion, and being a champion for change?
And they didn't hire COVID experts at their companies. They just made sure people sat down and solved the problem. Why do you have to hire people who, to actually do your job? Like, I don't understand that. That is another thing. Like, it's one thing, like, for people like, who've been in this space for a long period of time to come in and be experts. But like I told you, I'm not coming in to start all over. They're handing me, like, here's the strategy. You're part of the executive team. Part of your job is to ensure that I'm executing and you are executing. And so I agree. Like, companies figured out how to shut down companies, shut down offices, make sure everybody's working. You can figure out the same thing around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I agree. I agree. I'm so glad this is being recorded. I think this is going to be golden to someone's ears at some point. Jennifer, I'd love to get your feedback on that question.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that, companies definitely need to take a concerted effort in terms of hiring senior people of color. But I also think that there's another component of this, and that's about talent management, right? So I think that we need to, organizations need to nurture the talent that they have internally. And so, yeah, you're right, Libra, you're absolutely right. People come into an organization, they're there for a couple of years, and then they move on. It's, it's kind of a training ground. But I think that happens because they don't see opportunities. They don't see, people who look like them at the top. And so how do we nurture our Black and brown people and encourage them to stay with the organization? How do we let them see that there is opportunities for them to rise in the organization? And I think that happens through being very deliberate in your process, identifying who your high potential candidates are and actually really backing them, put the money where the mouth is, right? So if you say that you are looking to increase your senior level people and you have people in the organization that are really working hard for you, that are really interested in where the organization is going and the mission, let's support those individuals and add them to your succession plan and develop them to be your future leaders in the organization.
I agree. I can't tell you how many times I was glad that I was at the table to say, oh no, you can't do that. Like, that's not acceptable, because there wasn't enough diversity at the table and just not a full understanding of what is appropriate and acceptable in spaces outside of their own. And I think once businesses recognize the power and the value in diversity beyond what they have, it will just be absolutely powerful to them.
Absolutely. And that's why, mentoring programs are so critical in these organizations, that you have those that have the ability to help others to move up. So it is looking at how do you reach back and help those individuals move up in the organization? How do you nurture your current talent?
And what advice, I'm kind of flipping this a little bit, Jennifer, what advice would you give to our students about how they can make an impact? So from experience, I know our students are in varied positions within their organizations. They're in that entry level all the way up to senior level positions within organizations. Not many organizations are asking for feedback. So what advice would you give to our students on how they can make an impact and stir things up a little bit within the organization without being totally disruptive and overstepping?
It's an interesting question, but I don't think there's a cookie cutter approach to that, because I think the first thing you need to know is, what organization are you working for, right? And how do you navigate the culture of that organization? So what might be appropriate at one company may not necessarily be appropriate at another. So for me and the organization that I'm with, I think it's really about, taking opportunities to take on leadership roles, allow yourself to be uncomfortable and get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Be vocal, be a part of our employee resource groups, volunteer for projects that might be new and innovative, allow yourself to be seen. But again, that's the organization that I work for. I don't know if that's necessarily the process at other organizations. And the other thing, I think it's about networking. Find a mentor, find a sponsor, try to network. You need someone that's going to be your voice, be the person who can sponsor you at the table if you don't have a seat at that table. So that would be my advice.
Thank you. You mentioned employee network groups, and I think some of our students might be in organizations where that is a foreign idea. How can they, without being in HR, without being in a senior role, help to create such a group or such an organization such a group really within their organization to help with overall change and get the eye and the ear of the executive team?
So, I would say employee resource groups are not, okay, I was going to say not appropriate, but that's actually not the word I want to use. I don't know if every organization is ready for employee resource groups. So employee resource groups are really there, and Libra explained it lovely. They're really there to give a voice to different demographic groups. But senior leadership has to be ready for what they want, for what those groups are going to tell them, because they really need to be aligned to the business. So yes, they may do, events that are fun, like ethnic celebrations and things like that, but they are really there to help the business move forward. And a part of helping the business move forward is identifying issues and concerns of that particular group and what are some strategies that the organization needs to put in place to make them feel more included. All organizational leaders are not ready to hear that. So if you are working for an organization that you feel your leaders are not ready for that, I wouldn't suggest that you go in that path.
That's a good point. I like this question in the chat. How can we increase the level of diversity in STEM education? One area that really needs a more diverse workforce is doctors. And I could go on and on about that, but I'll just stop right there. I'll stick with the question at hand. Libra, do you want to take this one from a technology standpoint? Maybe not specific to doctors, but I'm happy to hear if you'll answer on that level as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the past couple of years has been a huge focus on getting brown people into STEM. I mean, without a doubt. I mean, everyone's talking about it. Schools are actually shifting their curriculum, getting especially more Black and Latinx young women into STEM, because that's been a problem. And then a lot of tech companies have created their own pipeline programs. I know when I was at PayPal, I created our HBCU program, which we pulled from HBCUs that people don't go to. I went to Spelman, but like people call us all the time. We're not your demographic. Like we went to schools like Houston Tillotson, Alabama A&M, Prairie View, schools not no one, but a lot of tech companies don't go to, and created a program and that would actually build up the pipeline to get it to be an intern and then convert them into actual full-time employees. So there's a lot of focus. Google started off with their Howard Googly program. And so I don't think that that's missing. Where I think the breakdown is in the education at the various schools, which is why a lot of the tech companies are working with these HBCUs to actually develop more up-to-date programming and skills, so that when the students who are already bright are coming into the workplace, they can compete. So there's a huge disconnect for what they're teaching at MIT and then what they're teaching at any HBCU school. Not because the students are not gifted, it's because of the resources. And if you think about, I went to Spelman, I love all my professors, but some of them were a little bit older. And so you have to think about how you start to add and supplement with a lot of the real quick, innovative, up-to-date coding and all that goes into just kind of that next level tech initiatives. So I do think there's work to be done. I do think there's also work to be done in education around a lot of tech employees assuming that HBCU students are not fit. It's not that they aren't fit. You just have to understand there's inequality in education and access. And so that's where I feel like the companies that do a better job of being successful around this, it's not a fit thing. It's more about how do we supplement and what do we need to do on the back end to ensure that the students that are coming from schools that didn't have the resources have the same amount of opportunities as others. So there is an investment for sure. Now, I'm not saying that the tech companies are all amazing and thinking that, oh, well, we'll just let anybody come in. I do think there's bias in the recruiting system, as they are in every company, but tech for sure. And so it's kind of, how do you reframe what a technologist look like? What does an engineer look like? And if you see more of them that look different from your average engineer, then it helps you to start to redefine what talent looks like in the door. So there's a focus for sure. I do think that there's work to be done, but there is certainly an investment, not even a focus, but there is an investment.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Marilyn or Jennifer, do you have anything to add specific to diversity in STEM? All right, I will move on. We have another question in the chat. How is the diversity of other groups dealt with outside of race, example, gender, age, etc.? Are those practices parallel to the process of dealing with racial diversity? And if not, why not? Jennifer, do you want to take that?
Okay, I hope I understand the question correctly. I think the question is asking, do you deal with the issues the same? And my immediate response to that is yes, but at the same time, I think you have to identify, what are the issues for each group, because it might be very different. And so again, I just think it's really important that we understand that this is not a cookie cutter approach. So just like I said, you have to identify what's appropriate and navigating the culture of an organization. I think the same is true when we're talking about different ethnic groups and what might be some of their concerns. So I don't know if I can just make a blanket statement that it is the same. For me, I always try to take a strategic approach whenever I'm dealing with any of this. And so I try to understand what are the concerns. And so that's why I lean very heavily on my employee resource groups. I'm a part of every group, as Libra talked about. I attend their meetings. I immerse myself in everything that they're doing, because it really helps me get an understanding of the different concerns for each of the groups so that I know how to approach them and what initiatives and strategies I need to put in place.
Thank you for that. Anything to add, Libra or Marilyn? I don't see any unmute. I'll take that as a no.
I think Marilyn,
go ahead.
Marilyn, were you going to say something? I thought that you unmuted.
Yes, I know when I attended a Malave leadership retreat last year, we had another group with us, the LGBTQ group, and they wanted us to understand how important it was for them to be able to identify themselves by his or her or they. And if we're not willing to open up and understand how others want to be understood, we know how we want to be understood. So it's a thing of bringing, we all came together in a room to be able to open up the conversation and to see how important it is that let them have their voice to be able to explain exactly, why that was important to them. So again, it's just a thing of opening up the discussion, opening up the table.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Marilyn. I mean, that's exactly right. I think every company the past couple of years have been dealing with pronouns and how you approach those who are wanting to be identified, and it's something very important to them. And so each ethnicity, orientation, people just, but everyone has their own thing. And so you have to approach it with this idea of equality. You have to approach it with this idea that everybody deserves to be heard. You can't always accommodate for everything. There's some stuff I was like, that's not a thing. We can't do that here. But for the most part, they want to be heard. They want to be recognized. And if they're part of this group, they obviously have felt marginalized at some point. And so I think Marilyn's point is that, pronouns was a big deal. I didn't even know, literally 2 years ago, I had to read all about them because I was like, I'm really confused because I haven't had to do that. And as a person who's not Black, they don't know what it's like to be me. I don't know what it's like to have to think about my identity all the time, or have people question it. And so there's a bit of empathy that needs to be with every single case. And I would even go as far as people who don't agree with you. Like we have this whole idea that you don't have to agree with me, but you have to respect. There's tons of organizations or ERGs or demographics that are slightly at odds, or think that we're paying too much attention to one group or the other. I mean, you have to understand, when I started diversity years ago, it was all about women. It was all about gender. No one was talking about brown people or people with disabilities or people that were veterans, none of that. It was all about women, advancing women. And it really was around white women. And so when we started to, break down those barriers and start to be very thoughtful about the different experiences for Asian women versus Latinx women, for Black women, and all the intersectionalities, you have to approach it differently, because everyone has a thing. Everyone has a way they want to be approached. Everyone has something they feel very close to. So you do have to, there has to be some kind of understanding, but I just feel like everybody needs to educate themselves. I'm a chief diversity officer. I didn't know what those pronouns were. I wasn't ignorant, and I didn't call that one friend I had. I educated myself. Like, I just don't understand. It's another thing. Figure it out, learn it. There's an internet. The tapping of the shoulder after George Floyd by every white person, for me to give them a history lesson of something they should have already known, drove me crazy. Because again, I didn't do that for the pronouns. I don't do that for veterans. I don't do that for a person with a disability. I'm reading so much about people with disabilities, visible, invisible, and so forth. I'm not tapping that one friend I know that's autistic and asking them to give me a rundown. And so I do think that we have to be sensitive, but I also think there has to be some empathy and learning along the way as people, as human beings.
That is great, Libra. Thank you. I agree. Education is key, right? Think about the group that we have here today. That's why we are here. We want to learn more. We want to provide learning opportunities to our students outside of the regular education, if you will. And I find that these conversations are the conversations that are so rich. But there's something to be said about that research that you do for yourself, about finding the right resources to get the answers that you need. And, we're kind of preaching to the choir here, but I think it's still worth saying. So over the summer, a lot of organizations posted on social media, Black Lives Matter. And I know at least 3 organizations that received huge backlash from their employees. You don't mean that, and that's the kindness of the feedback that I have heard of and personally seen. Organizations, I think, were surprised at how vocal their employees were about their thoughts on whether or not the organization was not only truly diverse, but that they truly meant it when they said Black Lives Matter. So I'd like to hear from each of you challenges and certainly opportunities as well that the recent focus on the Black Lives Matter movement has provided, whether it's personally or within your workplace. Whoever wants to start.
I mean, I can start. I think that I do know that there were companies that were really nervous about standing behind Black Lives Matter. I do know companies that were concerned that it would alienate their customers, alienate others, that it wasn't an inclusive message. And so that was really troubling to hear about that. And then there were companies that just went all Ben and Jerry's and was like, listen, we are so all about Black Lives Matter. This is how we're doing it. Ben and Jerry's does not care. I love them. They just are all about the social impacts and supporting and getting behind it. And so it became, what I found to be really interesting about Black Lives Matter, it became more around the the leader making the decisions whether to get behind it or not necessarily the company. And I will say that going forward, this idea of leadership is forever going to be etched in our minds around who pulled the plug on this, who got behind it, and so forth. I do think it became a little divisive at some point, and as a lot of companies are global, it doesn't translate in certain countries. It certainly translates in Europe. But I think in other countries, it just didn't translate. And so there was a lot of, well, what does this mean? Does this not mean that, like, you know, Muslim lives matter? Then you went all back and forth with this all lives matter. So I think outside of the US, I can certainly understand a bit of trying to wrap their arms around it, especially kind of in our APAC or kind of our Middle Eastern APAC regions. But I do think that there was a bit of divisiveness, and I do applaud those CEOs and presidents who stepped up and was like, this is how I'm going to do this. And for those who are a little afraid, I got it, but there were certainly those that were just not willing to do it. And they were just a little nervous of this whole, they wanted to be behind this all lives matter thing. And I call it a thing. So, yeah.
Jennifer, did you want to share as well?
Yeah, so I think, wait, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I want to make sure I answer the question.
Sure, I'd love to hear about opportunities or challenges that have come out of the Black Lives Matter movement, either personally or that you've seen within organizations.
Right, okay, so, you know, as I said, one of the challenges has been the why not me. So, you know, when you have an organization that focus on, will put a lot of focus on one group, other groups tend to feel like you're ignoring what their concerns and issues are. So I think there's a real balance that organizations need to play with that. You know, I actually grapple with, should an organization put out a statement about Black Lives Matter versus social injustice? And I see it different. And I actually think it should be more around social injustice. I think it can put, it can be viewed negatively when an organization specifically talk about Black Lives Matter. Not to say that I'm not supportive or that I don't think that Black Lives Matter, but I think a company has to be very strategic in how they handle a sensitive subject like that. One of the things I heard as I was conducting my lunch and learns is that Black employees were saying, you know, I don't want to be a mouthpiece. Like, I don't want to have to speak for all Black people. Don't come and ask me how I feel because I'm the only Black person you know, go and find out on your own, do your research. And it really takes building those relationships with individuals before you can come and ask me how Black people feel, because you're really asking me how I feel versus how all Black people feel. So I really struggle with, you know, should an organization put out something specifically to Black lives versus social justice in general?
Yeah, you know, thanks for that, Jennifer. I agree. As I'm in circles, if you will, where I am the only Black person, and some of the questions I truly cannot answer because I'm Black, but I wasn't born and raised in the US. So I don't understand everything Black. And so, you know, it doesn't mean that you're going to get all the answers if you talk to one Black person. I read White Fragility and I learned a lot. I just assumed that, you know, I have the color, and so I would understand what was in the book, but I learned so much. And the book wasn't even written by a Black person. I learned so much about Black people. So I think as much as organizations can recognize that getting information far and wide is what will help us to truly have depth and truly understand diversity, not just tapping one person on the shoulder and asking the question of how do you feel? Because, you know, depending on the day you get me, you might get a different answer of how do I feel? And I think that's the same for any individual, male, female, or regardless of their color.
But the one thing I will say, and I'm really happy about, is that this has really opened up the dialogue, right? So in the past, there have been things that have occurred that have allowed people to have conversation. But for some reason, this one is different. It's different now. And I think so many things happened on the heel, the Breonna Taylor, the Aubrey Marbury, but I can't remember his name. George Floyd, like all of these things happen back to back. And so I think it has provided us with an opportunity now to go much deeper in these conversations than we were before. And it seems like there was more interest in the conversations now. And so I think it really gives a lot of opportunities, not just for Black people, but for others as well. And I, being a diversity officer, I feel like I have more of a voice. I have more of an opportunity to have leadership hear what I've been saying all these years.
Yeah, thank you. Before we wrap up, Marilyn, you might want to give some input on this question that came in from the audience. How can we make changes to the business curriculum to embed concepts of diversity in the workplace in many of the courses that students take? I would love to hear your perspective on whether or not you feel that the courses that you've taken to date, you have been exposed sufficiently to diversity, or do you feel that there's so much more that we need to do?
So I'm on my last business course, thank goodness. And I would have to say throughout my years of taking, each individual business courses, and thanks to Dr. Wheeler also for being such a huge part of this second to last semester and helping me get through this. There can be changes made to the curriculum. I don't know if we discuss enough about diversity within the workplace. And I believe since I started, I'm not going to tell you how long ago, at SPS, there's been significant change in the workplace. And maybe it's something that we need to look over. SPS is such a diverse school. And, we have, like I'm in a classroom with, a 22-year-old and, I'm going to say, I'm in my mid 50s. So what they're learning, what they came out of a 22-year-old, what they know versus what I know and going into business is going to be something totally different from what I've experienced. So I believe there does need to be more changes to the curriculum. But again, it is an excellent curriculum, Dr. Knox. And I thank you guys for everything you've done for, the school and for myself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that, Carolyn. That's a great point that you mentioned about the different age groups in the classes. And I certainly noticed that in my classes, there really is diversity, certainly in gender and age in our courses. So that's a great takeaway. I think we have run out of time, but before we jump to a break, Jennifer, did you want to add anything to the curriculum? I know that is your sweet spot. Did you want to kind of wrap it up talking about diversity in curriculum and what we need for the future?
I think you just called on me, I'm not sure, but I would just like to add, one of the things I think that the biggest takeaway I hope people understand about all of this is that it starts at the top. You need your leaders to be supportive of this. You need your chief diversity officers to have a seat at the table. You need your chief diversity officers to be looking down in the organization, hearing the concerns, and trying to help those that they can pull up. But we can't do any of that unless we have leadership's participation and support. So this all starts at the top. And so that's why I'm just going to put a plug in for Dr. Knox's course. This is why learning about leadership is so critical to the success of any of this work that we do, because it all starts there.
Thank you. Ladies, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, and I know we could certainly go on for another hour, but I appreciate you sharing your experiences and certainly advice with our students. I know for me, this has certainly been a rich conversation, and I guarantee your students enjoyed it as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prudence,
Thank you.
Dr. Lewis, and Marilyn for this very important discussion. These are certainly challenging times, and our perspectives have been enhanced by such an informative conversation. So I want to thank you for a truly important discussion.